Hi, my name's Kate Mason, and today I'm talking to Tanya Lees and Carrie Evans, who are both members of CALM. And you're based in New Zealand, and CALM stands for Calm Alarmist Law Madness. And CALM has been very active in the managed retreat Kapiti area. So I've been talking in Australia about managed retreat as well, which was pretty much piggybacking off listening to New Zealanders, I think it was you, Tanya, as well, talking about the managed retreat that's coming in, the certificates on homes to say, that there's climate risks associated with the area that people are living in and adaptation plans. And I was hearing that in January and then thought I better look for that in Australia, and to realise that we've got enormous government plans underway with the New South Wales Disaster Mitigation Plan coming out with managed retreat on the agenda. And managed retreat, for people who aren't aware, is where the government and infrastructure companies can basically say they'll no longer service an area and you cannot live in an area anymore, and therefore can move you off your land. And with the New South Wales legislation, the government can on-sell your land based on climate change modelling. So I thought it was really important to know where you're up to in New Zealand. If I could hand it over to you both to introduce yourselves and how this all came about.
Sure. Well, thank you for having us on, Kate.
Thank you.
So I'm Tanya. I'm the spokesperson for CALM. So CALM was born probably about a year ago almost. And it was really after a big community meeting we had in Kapiti here, which was one of the only ones really that the Coastal Advisory Panel and the Kapiti District Council, Kapiti Coast District Council held. They had two other ones, but they weren't widely advertised. So really there were numbers going like 20 or 30 people. So it was pretty much kept on the down low. But for this Raumati one, some clever people had got out there and actually tipped the community off by putting flyers into letterboxes. So for this particular meeting, 200 people showed up for that. I went along to that personally with a friend. She was worried about her own property. So I went along with her, not knowing what to expect. I mean, I'm a renter, so I hadn't known anything about the Coastal Advisory Panel or any of these plans really until I went to that meeting. And I happened to sit at a table where Caroline was and we had a series of 4 questions that we had to answer on cards, which I know now was using the Delphi method, which is a psychological thing really to twist the answers into the way that they want it to reach some sort of consensus. So the information that I was finding out from the people at my table completely floored me, and I was the person who had to write down all of the answers which everyone at my table was giving me, and we had all the other tables doing the same thing. And then when you were the scribe writing it all down, you also had to stand up, which I didn't know about at the time. Mm-hmm. You had to speak into a microphone and, talk about findings from your table. So I got up and did that. And I think on my second time of speaking, the CAP chair, who was a former Prime Minister, Mr. Bolger, Jim Bolger, he actually approached me as I was speaking and stood probably about a couple of feet away from me, leaning heavily on his walking stick. And I didn't notice him at first, but he was just eyeballing me and trying to intimidate me. And that's when I said to him, "Are you trying to shut me down?" And then sort of after a while, he, with intervention from the chair of the Raumati Community Board, he sort of shuffled off. But that was a major eye-opener for me personally. Because
Firstly, I have a bit of a problem. Well, actually, we all did at the table that this card here shows a photo which is not even taken in Kapiti. So I think that is fear-mongering, and I think that should not even be on the card if it's not taken in Kapiti. So the things that we identify We didn't actually have any concerns about living here at all. We don't have concerns about erosion or flooding. We only have buses. We think that the science that's been used is scaremongering. For example, this card, it is irresponsible and implausible since they're using extreme modelling. That's the RCP 8.5H. We have concerns about the CAP process because individual home and business owners have not been notified or consulted that they are in an adaptation zone. We feel it is a predetermined outcome. Over 1,000 properties have already been identified for managed retreat in northern Kapiti. The community did not agree that ratepayers' money. Are you trying to shut me down? The community did not agree that ratepayers' money be utilised and did not agree that there is an extreme sea level rise problem. People would not buy here and live here if they ever thought that there was a problem, because there's not. It is all scaremongering.
Members of the community were actually saying, hey, well, you know, what's this managed retreat? And that's when Mr. Bolger got up, grabbed the mic and sort of said, you know, that's the last thing that we're on our minds, you know, it's not something that we want to do. But we've since found out.
Called everybody conspiracy theorists.
He did, which was like a red rag to a bull. And yeah, that's when the meeting went downhill quite rapidly. And we found out that's actually not even true, because we've gone over the minutes from, you know, Coastal Advisory Panel meetings, and managed retreat is mentioned numerous times. So it wasn't the case at all.
And Carrie, how did you get involved?
So a friend, just prior to this meeting that Tanya was talking about, where 200 people turned up, a friend went to another meeting in one of the next little towns over, and she became very aware that I think there was maybe 30 or 40 people there, but most of them seemed to be from the council or from Jacobs Consultancy, who wrote a very voluminous couple of reports for the council on adaptation, and yeah, that's another one to go into later maybe, so there were a lot of officials and very few people from the public, and so that's when, you know, we decided to get cracking and alert the community, and yeah, had people help with flyers, and then it just went from there. We formed very quickly. I think after that meeting, we all went to the pub and just sort of formed this group, and we've just been hitting the streets, and yeah, we've got a huge following now. We've got huge support. We just recently had our third community meeting, where we had to book a big venue, and we got 450 people from the community. We invited the mayor and the councillors and everybody, the media, but we said, this is our meeting, you're welcome to come along and listen. The mayor insisted on speaking, so we thought about that, and we decided, well, we're still in a democracy, so we'll allow you to have 10 minutes. Just to go back a step, we also became aware soon after that meeting that there was a blanket placing on people's limbs. I don't know what you call them in Australia, but the land information memorandums, where, you know, it has every detail about your property or a property that you want to purchase on it, right? And they had put a blanket statement on the limbs referencing this Jacobs report that had been done previously, and the title was Coastal Erosion and Inundation. Yeah, and there's a link, and I can give you the wording, but so that's a blanket statement with no public consultation. No one knew. And just
how many houses in Kapiti got
every property?
Didn't matter where you lived either.
And just to give some historical context, at around 2012, the council tried to do this with a hazard notice on limbs on all the coastal properties. They just basically put a red line through our limbs, and they were taken to court, and another group was formed at that time called CREW, Coastal Ratepayers United, and they helped in the court case, but it was taken by a resident, and they won, and the council had to remove this hazard because it wasn't fair, and the science was not there. So they've gone away, and 10 years later, they've produced another report by Jacobs, which is a huge consultancy firm around the world. And it's like we're in
How
round two.
can they do it now? Have they changed the legislation to allow it to be able to be put on housing certificates?
Well, we asked the mayor that at that public meeting where we had 450 people, that question was asked. She wasn't sure. She said that she actually promised that she would go away and they would get a second legal opinion, and that was 6 weeks ago.
Yes, about 6 weeks, and we're still waiting.
We are
know
waiting.
that they do have the answer, because I've been told that by the chief executive, who was also at that public meeting too. But yeah, I think they're probably choosing the words very carefully before they release it, because of court action, perhaps. But yeah, a total arrogance to keep the community waiting like this.
Okay, so Kapiti, how many people? How many? What's the population of Kapiti?
It would be around 57,000, I think.
And is this the only town this is happening in New Zealand?
No. We're one of the first ones where it's being tried at the moment, probably like a test case. But we do know that there's other places. There's Hawke's Bay. They were looking at doing that in Petone, which is near Wellington.
So basically, the sorry for all the acronyms, but the CAP panel, which was supposedly independent, but they were picked and paid for by our council. They came up with this a values-based model, a pathways model for coastal adaptation areas, and using the Jacobs report. And in the Jacobs report, they don't take account of hard protective structures going forward into the future. So we have a lot of our coast has got a big seawall, a really good seawall that's actually long overdue for replacement. It's about nearly 40 years old and has done a perfectly good job, but it does need replacing now. So they're a bit slow at doing that. But it didn't include seawall. It didn't include, it had factors for a rocky beach, and we have a sandy beach. We have an accreting coastline, which means it's actually building out towards Australia.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of historical data which shows we are actually uplifting because of tectonic activity. So they didn't really factor in any of those factors. So instead, we've ended up with these coastal adaptation areas right up the Kapiti coast, which go from the coast right on the coast to 2 kilometres inland.
Okay, and the 2 kilometres inland, is that hilly or is that flat?
Pretty much flat.
Yeah.
And
they're thinking, why 2 kilometres inland? What's the rationale?
Because going forward in the future, if there's no seawalls and with sea rise, the predicted sea rise, because they've used extreme modelling, they've used the RCP or SSP as it's now called, 8.5. They've used that, and so we've got this extreme outcome because I've used extreme modelling, which all along our mantra has been they've used implausible science, and they haven't followed proper democratic process because
with the community engagement.
Community engagement, but essentially they've used implausible science, extreme modelling.
Worst case scenario, and even the IPCC says that it's so unlikely. The probability of it ever happening is less than 1%. Yet they're still going on with it. We've never had a satisfactory answer on why they insist on using it, because that has a huge effect on our insurance, for example. So
the latest is that they have been saying that because we're doing this adaptation plan for our coast, that the insurance councils are likely, or insurance industry is likely to look favourably on us in terms of our insurances in the future.
I was just having a very quick look at a United Nations Environment Programme report, underfinanced, underprepared, inadequate investment and planning on climate adaptation leaves world exposed. I think that came out at the end of last year, and it's got a picture of a burning down house on the cover. But just in terms of what you talked about with having, to form CALM, to actually get the word out and to letterbox drop yourself, and it's meant to be, community is considered stakeholder, on the global scale. We're a stakeholder as well. And in this report, it talks about they have to, so basically the United Nations Environment Programme are the ones who help countries do their disaster mitigation plans. And they say that there's metrics that need to go in to assess the inclusiveness of adaptation planning processes, and that this is progressing really well. And a number of countries reported that stakeholders are systematically engaged in their adaptation planning, and it's increased to 83%. So I can bet you that it's Australia and New Zealand saying all stakeholders are involved, that we're all in this together. And yet it's you guys as just normal community members hearing about it just accidentally and having to let a box drop to get the word out to the public who have no idea. Then
and still continue not to.
And that you've said before, they put those certificates on the limb, they're saying about the coastal hazards, and that people weren't even told about it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. We found out quite by chance.
Yes.
And they'd already apparently been on there for almost a year.
Yeah.
9 months or something.
No, nobody knew though.
It was only a friend was looking for a property, and so she got she was interested in buying a property, and so she got the limb, and she was like, oh, there's this on there, and that was well inland. So she alerted us, and then we did a bit of
detective work.
We
found they were everywhere, including places that are elevated up on a hill. So it makes no sense at all. There's no
that would be mudslides. I mean, when you look at all the things that it covers, this disaster mitigation, it's basically covers everything. So even though it's coastal at the moment, they talk about some mudslides, too much rain. And
that's right.
Yeah, probably liquefaction and all sorts.
Even the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, say that there's no signal for any extreme weather events over and above normal. There's no signal. There's nothing outside of the ordinary over and above normal storms, and nothing's actually. So there's this belief that in our new climate paradigm that the weather is speeding up somehow, that we're going to get more catastrophic storms and more loss of life. Well, none of the data, the actual data reflects that. And actually, when you look into the history, and this, there's an amazing interview by Leighton Smith, who's a well-known radio broadcaster here in New Zealand, and he interviewed a man called Dr. Tim Ball, who actually the inventor of the hockey stick graph, which Al Gore used to sensationalize the CO2 rise, and that was going to cause temperatures to go up and global warming panic. Michael Mann, who invented that hockey stick graph which started at 1850 onwards, Michael Mann took this Dr. Tim Ball to court because Tim Ball was saying this is just all a complete crock. Yeah. The UN is based on they're only looking at human-induced factors. No other factors are included. So nothing else. And of course, we know that there's many things that impact the climate, like solar flares and the tilt of the Earth's axis and the amount of CO2 that the oceans can release and absorb. And none of that was considered. And so this is where we are at the moment. It's all based on this belief that CO2, driven by human use of fossil fuels, and they've taken one tiny little bit of the whole big picture. And the other thing that they never do is look at climate data pre-1850. It's like the whole world began in 1850. We know when you look back, we've had lots of. We're in another cycle. We're in another cycle which is slightly warming. We're going to go back down into a cooler period, but none of that is factored into the whole picture. So it's pretty alarming.
It's so misleading what they're doing, isn't it?
And, you know, people think that CO2 drives temperature. That's not true at all. And science is clear on that. When you look back on the historical data, we've had CO2 goes up, and about 200 years or so later, temperatures kind of lag behind, but they're not. It's not the other way around. It's not CO2 first and then temperature.
Yeah, I've
stuff like that people just and that CO2 is vital for life. If you asked a young climate activist if halving the amount of CO2 that we have in our atmosphere at the moment would solve the climate change problems, they would probably say yes in all reality. And yet we would then, there'd be no plant life that would be able to survive under those low CO2 conditions. We actually need more CO2, not less. So it's
interesting the way the narrative's been crafted, but the main thing, like I always focus on, is what are the solutions they're bringing in under the narrative? So regardless if you think, you know, there's human-induced climate change that's causing the catastrophic world events that are constantly highlighted in the news now, and weather alerts that used to be like weather used to be just a normal summer.
Weather. It just used to be weather.
About it, etc.
Yeah.
But the thing is, even if you do accept, you think the climate change thing, to then go on and accept the solutions that are being put in place without any scrutiny on who's going to be owning the assets and the infrastructure and the assets, and what's the wealth transfer that's going on and is going to increasingly go on under this climate change narrative. That's a whole nother thing that people can enter into the debate and to really understand more about that. So if I just swing right back to the beginning, how did this all start? Was it with the Jacobs report that that was at the first step in New Zealand?
Yes, except we did have that historical, you know, hazard lines, you know, in 2012. But basically, the Jacobs report, it was apparently there was a process in the Hawke's Bay, which is further north in the North Island of New Zealand, where they tried to implement this. They did a Jacobs report there, and out of that they tried to come up with a pathways based on a whole series of values, but it wasn't until they did the costings to implement that pathways system right at the end for adaptation, coastal adaptation, that the community said, hang on a minute, we can't afford that. And that's pretty much what they've done here, isn't it? So far we've spent ratepayers here in Kapiti have spent about $4 to $5 million on the reports and the consultants, and they've only just recently released put a value on the different pathways, some of which are mitigating, some, you know, there's a variety of things, with managed retreat being the end one. They put a value on those, and it's in the billions. It's in the absolute billions, and they've only just released. So they've gone through this contorted process with no costings done, and then right at the end they've gone, oh, that'll cost.
And then it talked about that global financing for the infrastructure and the adaptation is needed throughout the world. So have you kind of worked out how the financing model is going to look? How much of the people?
No. Although,
what are the entities that fund? What are they going to get in return?
Yeah, that's still we're still sort of, I guess, trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
We've a few weeks ago we became aware that there was submissions were open on an inquiry on climate adaptation / managed retreat, which we didn't know about. So we rapidly put in a submission, and there was an expert working group report that was carried out last year on climate adaptation, which was pretty horrendous. And we thought under the old government it would just, you know, once we had our new government come in at the end of 2023, we thought that would be kicked to the touch. It was pretty confronting. It was basically a removal of private property rights as we know it. It plan to, it talked about bringing in a separate Crown entity for climate adaptation managed retreat. Yeah, and they'll bring in this a managed retreat, a Climate Adaptation Act, I guess they'll call it. It's still going through the process. So it started with an expert working group last year. They had a submission process on that. From that, they had 147 submissions, I think it was. Only 16 of those were from private individuals.
Yeah.
And then so with that change of government, they've come up with a second round of submissions for this Climate Adaptation Act that they want to bring in. And nobody knew about it again, and it'd been open a week already, but the submissions closed, and we've just found out that, so from the last submission round, they got 147 submissions. This time round, we got 1,119.
Yeah.
So,
Well done.
with some really good, we had some really good, credible scientists around the country putting in
some real
submissions.
heavyweights. And we also wanted to thank Reality Check Radio, which I know you know about too, because you've been on there a few times, Kate, but they really got behind us and had templates as well that people could use, which I think really helped, because apart from that, it was yet another thing where government had kept it under the radar, hoping that no one would see it, really.
And it's the big change that I've been trying to sort of explain to people is, apart from it's a complete change of private property rights as we know it, but they've gone from a post recovery, if you like, from extreme weather events to this preemptive adaptive model. So we're going to move everyone away before the extreme weather event could happen. And it's all based on a well-being model, as opposed to, we've always had this risk-based approach, which, on life and property. Now it's all about the well-being, and essentially the well-being of the community. So your property may be good, your neighbours might have to, get a bit flooded or whatever, but we're going to move you as a community, because that's for the well-being of everybody.
For your own good.
Do you think, is that the value-based model that you were talking about?
Yes,
it's equity.
Exactly it.
Equity.
And
Okay, so that's in our Australian government documents as well, that to keep the community together, because communities are so important to each other, you have to move everyone together. Which of course, of course implies that there's somewhere you're going to move people in on mass scale.
So if they're talking about the separate Crown entity for climate adaptation / managed retreat, and they will have overriding powers if they're talking about mandating every council in the country to develop adaptation plans, and then if some trigger is reached in that adaptation area, and it could be anything from whatever they decide to, it might be a property gets flooded once every 2 years, or insurance withdrawal, then some trigger will be reached and you'll be deemed to be in a managed retreat area. The final say goes to this Crown entity, and you'll have no recourse. No appeals. The councils will be immune from liability, because they've handed it over to the Crown entity, and they can cancel the title on your property. There's no recourse if it's a batch that you own, a holiday home, if you own a second property like a rental property, which a lot of Kiwis do, like a lot of Australians do. It's part of their retirement fund, if you like. And if they want to get out of the property market, go, no, I want to sell it now, they won't get any compensation unless they agree to purchase another property in another area out of the adaptation zone and carry on renting it out. Then they may get some compensation out of that. It's just
and that is huge. I mean, you imagine there's some wealthy people, living in Wellington, which is not that far away. They've got beautiful homes down the coastline here, well in excess of $1 million, and they'll get nothing back for it. Nothing.
So nothing, because is that where they've said the people might get a bit of assistance with removing their second?
Yeah.
but they might
Yeah.
actually do a bit of
Yeah,
fun.
That would be minimal.
bulldoze your batch.
Yeah.
No, you won't get anything for that.
No, it makes no
You'll
sense.
pay. You'll basically pay.
And if you're, and they talk about equity all the way through that expert working group document. Equity is throughout. So if you've got good equity in your home because you've worked hard all your life, whatever, and your neighbour perhaps doesn't, then your equity can be used to pay for your neighbour, basically.
That sounds
They're
about
using it
communism.
in that way. They're actually
Well,
using
that is the assumption
Mm.
in this working group
Yep.
expert working group document. And a lot of the submissions on that last year, in the first round of submissions, were highly supportive of this expert working group report. Most of them came from councils, and the banking and the insurance industry also had submissions in there. Yeah.
Mm.
So it felt very, it was pretty shocking actually to discover it. So we're just waiting now. We're in this process of this climate adaptation inquiry.
We're in a holding pattern at the moment. People are in limbo here.
What's the next steps?
Well, we're giving the council a bit of time to process the CAP, the Coastal Advisory Panel's report, and depending on how long that takes, we might have to put a bit more pressure on them. We kind of suspect that they may stall it while they're waiting for this inquiry on climate adaptation to go through, which kind of makes sense, but won't give anybody here any.
No, we're afraid that they're going to just park it, and people are going to be left with this over their heads. The uncertainty. So we want to know one way or the other. But a lot of the councillors themselves, they don't have the scientific or the economic know-how to really be making a decision on this.
No.
In some ways, we're better equipped for that with the amount of research that we've done, but it is quite concerning that some of the councillors, in particular, they're very opposed to the work that we're doing.
Well, I think there's a lot of groupthink going on. They've been fed a narrative. They've been, as everybody has been, which has come down through the IPCC and the UN and the 2030 agenda and so forth. And they're just going on that. And
they should do more research.
Yeah. So crucially, out of the CAP report, the councillors get to vote on it, whether they accept it or reject it. And we just went to a council meeting last week where the report was presented to the council, and they went to great pains to say that they weren't receiving it. They weren't accepting it. They were only receiving it.
Yeah.
They weren't accepting it. Because there was a big contingent of people, locals there, and so the councillors are going to get to vote on it. But in the meantime, a council officer will write up a summary, and we think they're going to do another round of public consultation, but we have an extreme lack of trust in that process because it's been so flawed. Yep. And that officer will write the summary that the councillors will vote on.
CALM did a protest outside that meeting, so that was on the 20th of June. So we protested. We had a lot of support. We were out there with signs, and there was so much support, tooting, as people drove past. And then we probably had there were 10 public speakers, because then we had the council meeting after that where the CAP report was received. And I was the first public speaker, and basically every other person who came to speak, which included Coastal Ratepayers United, they had 2 representatives. They all echoed the same thing. We don't want this. We also have an economic
analyst.
Who has worked for places like the World Bank, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the International Monetary Fund, and he's saying we can't afford this.
So he basically did a cost benefit analysis. So for what he was saying was, for every dollar spent, you get 1 cent back on that
Which doesn't make
investment.
sense.
It makes no economic sense. And he's an independent guy, and the council did agree at this council meeting recently that they would allow him to do a more in-depth economic analysis on the Jacobs report. He's asked for the modelling, for the models that Jacobs used and the models that CAP, Coastal Advisory Panel, used, and he's going to do a more in-depth economic analysis. And I think that's that will probably hopefully blow it out of the park, because the cost will be, you know, as I said, it's in the billions, and you know, why would you spend billions of dollars now for something that may never happen in 100 years' time?
No,
time frame. That's what they're looking at, is 100 years.
So the New South Wales Government Disaster Mitigation Plan, which talks about, you know, the government and the Act and being allowed to take land off people due to climate change modelling, etc. They have like the big, maybe 150-page report, but they have a 2-sided page for councillors.
That's what they get.
Yeah. They don't have anything in there. So there's just this managed retreat is all through the bigger report. There's not even one mention of it in the double-sided page that the councillors read. So our politicians, by the main, are being really dumbed down and just given these tiny little briefs that do not actually, you know, show the bigger picture. And I just wanted to raise one more thing, that the United Nations has a report called Our Common Agenda. Our common agenda, so if the United Nations, and they're calling for a climate disaster, climate emergency for the whole world, I'm wondering, and then they're going to meet for this. So it's Our Common Agenda is part of a rolling series. So the world leaders are meeting in September for the Summit for the Future, which is about our common agenda. And I'm wondering if they do, you know, the United Nations is global corporate entity, basically calls a climate emergency for the whole of the world. Will that then be the door that opens, that makes this not so much about our local councils anymore and their decisions? It has to be done on this global scale.
Yeah,
because they do talk about even this United Nations Development Program report that I referenced before talks about 40% of the world living in climate risk areas. And there's an article by the BBC saying 3 billion people will need to be moved because of disasters upcoming.
And that's why I think it's so important that people understand where that the stuff coming out of the IPCC and the UN is their terms of reference were, they only were allowed to look at human-induced climate changes. That was their terms of reference and the definition that they were given. They didn't look at any other factors, which are massive. I mean, human-induced is a tiny amount. We're not saying that there is no changes caused by humans, but it's a minute amount compared to solar flares, oceans, all the rest of it. It's easy stuff to go and find if you want to go and, people want to go and look for it. In fact, Ian Plimer, that does your Australian lovely man, does his book Green Murder. It just lays it out in the historical context, the whole story. And it is a story. It's literally a story, a made up story. And when you go back and look at that, and that there's no climate modelling done, or no account of historical data pre-1850, humans have lived in far warmer times and with far higher CO2 and thrived in the Roman times and the medieval times. We're just in another cycle. We may well see extreme weather events get slightly worse as the earth oscillates, or other factors, but it won't be because of human-induced climate changes.
Resilient Cities is Cities Network is Rockefeller funded, and we've got Resilient Sydney. You've got Resilient Auckland, or one of your capitals.
Wellington. Wellington is a resilient city.
So that's Rockefeller funded, and the definition of resilient is something like potential possibilities of events happening. It's no longer risk, like what you're saying, risk case scenario where there's actual risks and they're analysed. It's like this whole, we're just basically in a world of rolling crises. This is what the documentation it doesn't matter. It's everything. It's education. It's climate change. It's whatever else. We are in a world of rolling crises, so we have to be centrally controlled and
For your own good.
yeah, for the common good of the whole planet. But
Safety.
yeah, safety. And basically, if you can, again, that needs unpacking. Who's the funders? Who's going to benefit from this? Where are the assets going? Have you come across anything where they're talking about nature mitigation strategies?
Not really, but we are aware of the 30-30 and the 50-50 agenda as part of the Sustainable Development Goals under the UN.
The significant natural areas, the SNAs.
They're more on farmland though, but yeah.
But they talk about sort of rewilding. So possibly these areas will kind of become roped off because they're too dangerous, and we won't be able to go there.
Well, it's going to be private corporations financing nature mitigation. So they're going to be, like the rewilding or I mean, I don't know, maybe they could even mine in there for critical minerals. Who knows? But basically the nature mitigation, then the corporate, because Australia's doing a nature market at the moment. So they make it very clear that corporate entities are going to be, and wealthy individuals are going to be funding nature mitigation strategies, which I imagine, like when your house is taken off you, then it can be handed over to some corporate entity to rewild, but they will have a level of ownership. And this is the thing again that I want to keep reiterating: who is going to own the assets and the land? As we are, and they do talk about urbanization. It's so important to be in densely packed urban areas for for these rolling crises.
Yeah.
So who's going to own all the land when we're kind of moved into more resilient areas?
Yeah, possibly for us it could be the local tribes, the
local
Indigenous tribes.
And in fact, in that, sorry Tanya, cut you off, but in that expert working group paper that came out last year, they talk very much in there about you could have your land title cancelled, but not if you're Māori, because they'll keep their land and they'll be helped to move their house away from any danger. But everybody else,
incredibly divisive, isn't it? I mean, that's starting to become like a co-governance.
And in fact, the CAP pathways model that was done for our local council, there was the iwi got to vote on their value rating, and basically for every pathway their preferred option was managed retreat.
That's really worrying, because that's driving a wedge in your community.
Absolutely. And I think it's very purposeful. So even with how it's gone from Indigenous or traditional custodians in Australia to First Nation people, the language has changed in some way to imply that anyone that isn't Indigenous really has no right to be here.
Yeah, we're getting that too. Yeah,
it's a definite narrative that we are, and not. I'm not saying that it's not real things to reconcile with and to find a way forward with, but I think this is a crafted narrative, because when you look at Australia plans, they say 72% of Australia will be in Aboriginal Indigenous corporations' hands by 2030. Right. And then they say we have philanthropic partners ready to act. We've got partners. So what I'm seeing is that will be corporate entities coming through the traditional custodians or the land councils to be able to get their hands on land.
Yeah. So we've got land grabs going on, control issues, and the ordinary citizen totally misses out on, It's an awful situation, and I think you're probably a little bit behind us at the moment. And you were talking about how you were having those disaster mitigation. We went through that as well, but we kind of didn't realise at the time what that was preceding. But yeah, they were coming through because our biggest threat here is tsunamis. So they were having all these tsunami workshops. Well, yeah, it is. But an earthquake would cause a tsunami, and this is what they were doing was, go around, and it's all about fear mongering. It's all about scaring people. And this is what the last few years has been all about. There's been one crisis after another. And at the moment, it's the climate.
It'll be
And
rolling.
specifically sea level rise.
Yes, yeah, the sea levels are rising.
And
You know,
we know that,
people
yeah.
surf here all the time. People have lived here for decades, and the average person is not seeing any change.
Yeah.
And it might be rising very slightly, but nothing to the extent of what they're saying.
Have you looked at anything with the insurance companies and what's going on more globally with insurance? Have you looked at how the insurance aspect is going to play itself out?
Well, we do know that insurance withdrawal is happening here on the coast right now. And I did my own research. I sort of phoned up pretending I owned a property here. And things weren't too bad until we got to the LIM reports. And I mentioned about the reference to the Jacobs report being on it. And then the whole tone changed. It's like, yeah, we're going to have to let our underwriters know about that, and that will be their decision. So it does have a massive, I mean, we've been tainted by even just having that on all the LIM reports. And that's a major red flag to the insurance companies. So I think that, yeah, there are people who are profiting from all of this. And when you look at who owns some of the banks and the insurance companies, there's a huge conflict of interest there.
Yeah, so the insurance, so 1 in 25 houses in Australia uninsurable by 2030, but that could be just now. I'm starting to think that's probably not, it'll be a lot more than that. They're starting to put out reports every,
Astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
yeah, they're just, I mean, they're putting
Well, I
out,
can see that happening here, that scenario, because
Yeah.
as I said before, where you can't, there's really nowhere in New Zealand you can live
No.
where you're not near a fault line or the coast or a river or a floodplain or and we accept that, like we accept a certain level of risk,
Yeah.
you know, and you mitigate for that. As I said, you plan for it, but yeah, the whole scenario's changed.
Mm.
yeah, the whole landscape's changed, but it's been moving in motion for quite a long time globally, in documents that we just weren't aware of. So
No.
at the most basic level, we could say our government's done a terrible job of bringing the people along with them if they felt this was a genuine emergency.
We actually did an OIA on it to our council. We asked who decided that there was going to be a climate emergency for our area. We asked them to show us the science that was based on. And it was basically decided on by a group of local high school students led by a climate activist who's now a councillor.
In her early 20s.
Yeah, they declared that she was a lot younger then, and they declared that, you know, we needed a climate emergency. And so that was slapped on us back in 2019, and we're like, where's the scientific evidence for that? Like,
No,
there isn't.
That's the education, the transformation of the global education, as well as to create these activist children to bring in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it looks like it's just this grassroots stuff, but it's all coming from, again, another global arena to get.
And it's so shocking. There are so many children now that have such severe anxiety. A lot of it is based in the whole climate scaremongering. They're making, and as they get older, they're making decisions perhaps not to have children, to the jobs that they choose, whether they save or not, because what's the point? They're being told that, you know, the earth systems are going to collapse in, I don't know what it is now, 7 years. And if I could share this one little anecdote with you, about 2 years ago, my daughter was at college, and she came home from her year 12 biology class, and she said, Mum, the biology teacher told me today that the Earth's ecosystems are going to collapse in 18 months' time. And she was distraught. And I sat her down and said, that is just a load of rubbish. That is just not going to happen. I mean, this is shameful. It's just shameful what we're doing to our young people. It's, you know, and we need to, as adults, I think we need to start saying it's not true. Like, this is not true. You know, and that's why I think it's so important that we look at the historical data and also where the story has come from.
Absolutely. There's a book called The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg, which is really
Oh,
good.
that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Parents, because of children that are, because it really just goes through all the backers of Greta. So, you know, how it was made to look like this girl was just standing outside an embassy for 2 days with a sign and somehow got global attention. It's a very different story behind the scenes. Of course, that makes no sense that one child would be picked up by global media within 2 days of standing outside an embassy. So, yeah, so there's a whole nother realm to this, of these children being created to actually bring in really, really bad stuff for their future, and that benefit corporate entities, basically. Okay, so how do people get in touch? So with CALM, how do they get in touch with you? And no, I think you've made it pretty clear that this isn't just Kapiti. This is coming for probably the whole of New Zealand incrementally. So it's worth people's while in New Zealand to actually start to pay attention to what's happening in Kapiti. So how can they find out more about you?
Well, they can visit our website, which is capiticalm.com. We've also got a Facebook as well. So all the links are on our website. And we would encourage anybody who wants to get in touch with us to do so if you think you can help us, or perhaps you need help. You know, we've been pretty busy these days, but yeah, we do want to help other people who will be going through this as well, other parts of New Zealand. And if there's anyone, you know, who feels that they have got something they can contribute, skills wise, you know, we're more than happy to hear from you.
Because you're volunteer run, you're just a group of people who live in the community who just become aware and actually started wanting to do something about it. So well done. And I think it is this thing that we need more and more people to come through with skills and they can fill in the blanks, you know, because there's a lot to try to understand in this realm.
And I was going to say, and it can seem very overwhelming at the beginning, but something that's really kind of quite basic to do, if you're, you know, just starting out, is do an official information act, and you can go and find out how to do that. It's not that difficult at all. It's just basically an email, but you need to have the question worded correctly and send it to the right people in the council. But just ask, how did the find out, first of all, if you do have a climate emergency, you know, wording in council, a statement in your council documents. Find out who came up with that, who agreed to that emergency, and what is their science, what science is that based on? Ask them to just provide that, and then just, you know, go from there. Get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people together. Start a group and just start looking at what your council is saying, what documentations are out there.
Because we actually did an OIA, or somebody actually did it and sent it to us, asking about, you know, how did there come to be a climate emergency? What are you basing it on? And all they do is just a UN spiel about how the UN...
Something from the IPCC.
Yeah, we were looking for something a bit more local, you know. So yeah, this is all under the umbrella of the UN.
It is.
And it's interesting that, that former Prime Minister was the one who signed New Zealand up to Agenda 21.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it is interesting. Well, thank you so much, ladies, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you for everything
you do.
Kate.
Well done on your work.
Yeah.